the corporation that conquered an empire. Inside the East India Company's ledger. Part 1. The ledger opens. How a room full of merchants started a war machine. London, 1599. A city of roughly 200,000 people. Most of them cold, most of them hungry, most of them living within a mile of the river that also served as the sewer. The streets near the docks smell of tar and salt and rotting timber. Somewhere near Leadenhall Street, in a building that would not impress anyone today, a group of men are having a meeting. They are not kings. They are not generals. They are not priests or philosophers or explorers in the romantic sense. They are merchants. Wealthy, yes. Ambitious, certainly. But merchants first. Men who think in terms of margins and risk and the stubborn mathematics of return on investment. They are meeting because of spice. Not as a metaphor. Literally, physically, urgently, because of spice. The price of pepper in London had just tripled. Nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon were selling for sums that would make a modern commodities trader dizzy. And the reason was simple. Portugal and Spain had locked down the trade routes. If you wanted spice in Europe in 1599, you bought it through Iberian middlemen at Iberian prices, on Iberian terms. And these men, these cold, calculating, magnificently practical English merchants had decided they were finished accepting those terms. They pooled their money. They sent a petition to Queen Elizabeth VI. They asked for a monopoly on all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope, with the legal authority to make commercial agreements, establish outposts, and defend their interests by force if necessary. On the last day of the year 1600, Elizabeth signed the charter. The East India Company was born. It is tempting, in retrospect, to see something ominous in that founding moment, to read the future into the paperwork, to notice the clause granting the company the right to make war or peace with any non-Christian ruler and feel a chill. But that would be applying hindsight in a way that distorts the story. The men who sat in that room in 1599 were not planning an empire. They were planning a trade route. Their ambition was commercial, not territorial. They wanted access to the markets of Asia, not control of them. The distinction matters because it explains how the company's transformation happened. Not through conspiracy, not through a secret master plan, but through a series of entirely rational decisions that accumulated over decades into something no one had designed and almost no one had anticipated. This is, in many ways, a more disturbing story than the conspiracy version would be. The first voyages were, to put it gently, underwhelming. The company dispatched its initial fleet in 1601 under the command of James Lancaster. 5 ships, 480 men. Lancaster himself had been on the spice routes before and knew what to expect. Month after month of open ocean, storms that could dismast a ship in an afternoon, the slow creep of scurvy through a crew, and the very real possibility that the Portuguese would attack before you reached your destination, which they did. Lancaster returned to London in 1603 with enough pepper to turn a modest profit and a report that made clear the scale of the obstacles ahead. The spice trade, he explained, was not a free market waiting to be entered. It was a contested space, controlled by established powers who were not interested in sharing. The company's early investors, the men who had funded those first voyages with their own money, staking private fortunes on a speculative enterprise, were getting anxious. Returns were slow. The risks were enormous. Several early voyages ended in disaster. One ship was lost entirely. Another returned so depleted of crew that it barely made port. What saved the company in those early years was not a strategic breakthrough. It was a structural innovation. In 1612, the company moved away from the model of individual voyage investments, where each expedition was funded separately and profits divided at the end, and adopted a system of permanent joint stock. Investors bought shares in the company itself, not in specific voyages. The company became, in its financial architecture, recognizably modern. It had a board of directors elected by shareholders. It had annual general meetings. It had a permanent capital base that could fund long-term strategic decisions rather than just short-term trading expeditions. This change is easy to underestimate, but it was, in terms of what followed, arguably the most consequential organizational decision in the history of capitalism before the 20th century. Permanent capital means permanent ambition. When your investors can sell their shares tomorrow, you manage for next quarter. When your investors are committed to the enterprise itself, you can plan for the next decade. The East India Company, reborn as a joint stock corporation, began planning for the next decade. And what that decade required, the company's directors concluded, was not just trading access. It was physical presence. Permanent, fortified, defensible physical presence. The word they used was factory. A factory in the early 17th century did not mean a place of manufacturing. It meant a trading post, a building or complex of buildings where company agents called factors lived and worked, storing goods, negotiating deals, maintaining the relationships that commerce required. The company began establishing factories along the western coast of India, Surat in 1612, Madras in 1639, Bombay in 1668. Each factory needed to be defended. Defense required men with weapons. Men with weapons needed commanders, supply lines, and fortifications. And so each factory, almost by bureaucratic inevitability, became something more than a warehouse. It became, in miniature, a military installation. The man who understood this transformation most clearly and exploited it most ruthlessly was not a general or a politician, but a company servant named Thomas Pitt, governor of Madras in the early 1700s. Pitt was the kind of man the company reliably produced in its middle period. Commercially brilliant, morally flexible, convinced that the application of sufficient force to any problem was not a last resort but a reasonable first option. Pitt consolidated the company's authority in Madras through a combination of diplomatic manipulation, strategic bribery, and the pointed reminder that the guns on the walls of Fort St. George were loaded. He didn't conquer anyone. He didn't need to. He simply made it abundantly clear to every local ruler within reach that trading with the company on the company's terms was preferable to the alternative. This model, call it commercial coercion or perhaps just aggressive negotiation backed by credible military threat, became the template for company expansion. You did not need to occupy a territory to control it. You needed to make the cost of non-compliance higher than the cost of compliance. And to do that, you needed an army. Not a large army, not yet, but an army. By the 1680s, the company employed roughly 1,000 European soldiers and a growing number of Indian troops, fighters recruited locally, trained in European military methods, paid company wages. They were the seed of what would eventually become the most powerful private military force in human history. But in the 1680s, they were almost sufficient to cause catastrophe. The company's then governor, Sir Josiah Child, had an idea. A bold idea by his own assessment. A catastrophically stupid idea by almost any other measure. Child believed the company had been too deferential to local rulers. He believed it was time to establish, by force, a permanent territorial foothold in India, to move from commercial enterprise to something closer to colonial governance. In 1686, Child launched what became known as Child's War, a simultaneous assault on Mughal trading interests along the Indian coast, combined with an attempt to seize the port of Chittagong. It was a military and diplomatic disaster of the first order. The Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, one of the most powerful rulers on earth at that moment, responded with the controlled fury of a man who has been deeply underestimated. He expelled the company from its factories. He seized its assets. He imprisoned its agents. Child, from the safety of London, insisted the strategy was sound. The men living with the consequences in India disagreed. The company was saved, in the end, not by military force, but by the oldest tool of commerce, the groveling apology. The company's representatives prostrated themselves before the Mughal court, literally and figuratively. They begged for permission to return. They promised to behave. They offered reparations. Aurangzeb, calculating that the revenue from trade with the company exceeded the cost of their presence, eventually agreed. The company came back, and it learned a lesson, though not quite the lesson its directors believed they were learning. The official lesson, as recorded in company correspondence of the period, was something like, "We must be more cautious. We must not provoke powers stronger than ourselves." The actual lesson, absorbed slowly and practically by the men on the ground in India, was different. We must never again be in a position where anyone is strong enough to expel us. That lesson drove the next half-century of company strategy. Not conquest, not the flag-planting imperialism of storybooks. Something more patient, more methodical, and in many ways more effective. The systematic accumulation of military capacity, positioned always as defensive, always as commercial necessity, always as the minimum force required to protect legitimate business interests. They built, fort by fort, company by company, garrison by garrison. And the Indian political landscape in the early 18th century was cooperating with them in ways they could not have anticipated. The Mughal Empire was fracturing. The death of Aurangzeb in 1707 set off decades of succession struggles, regional fragmentation, and the rise of competing powers. The Marathas, the Nawabs of Bengal, the Nizams of Hyderabad, each of whom sometimes saw an alliance with the company's military as a useful tool in their own internal conflicts. The company did not create Indian political division, but it entered that division with money, weapons, and an almost inhuman patience for incremental advantage. By 1740, the East India Company operated trading posts across the subcontinent, a navy of its own vessels, and a standing army that no one in 1600, no one who sat in that room arguing about pepper, would have believed possible. The ledger that had opened with the scratching of 17 signatures on a royal charter now recorded something that had no precedent in the history of commerce. A corporation had become a military power, and no one, not in London, not in Delhi, not anywhere, had quite noticed the moment it happened. Part 2. The balance sheet of blood. When shareholders voted for war, there is a portrait of Robert Clive that hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in London. He is young in it, younger than the legend allows. Round-faced, a little heavy, dressed in the kind of uniform that was designed to communicate authority rather than earn it. He looks like what he was when he arrived in India in 1743, a clerk, a 19-year-old clerk from Shropshire, hired by the East India Company to copy figures into ledgers, translate correspondence, and generally perform the administrative labor that empire requires before it knows it is building itself. He was, by most accounts, miserable. He attempted suicide twice in his first years in Madras. The heat was unbearable. The work was tedious. He had come from a family that expected great things of him and had delivered him to a desk in a trading post where great things seemed constitutionally impossible. What saved him, or what transformed him, depending on your judgment, was a musket. When the French-backed forces of the Nawab of Arcot besieged Madras in 1751, Clive volunteered for military duty. He had no formal training, no rank worth mentioning. What he had was an appetite for risk that his miserable years of paperwork had compressed into something close to recklessness. And in the chaos of colonial warfare in mid-18th century India, recklessness, properly directed, was nearly indistinguishable from brilliance. He captured the fort at Arcot with 200 soldiers. He held it for 53 days against a force of 10,000. When it was over, his name was in every company dispatch sent back to London. And the directors who read those dispatches understood, with the cold clarity of men who think in terms of what things are worth, that Robert Clive was not a clerk. He was an asset. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the company that Clive was working for by the 1750s. It was no longer the cautious, margin-obsessed trading enterprise of its founding decades. A century and a half of operation in India had changed its nature in ways that its original shareholders would have found barely recognizable. It had a navy. It had a chain of fortified trading posts stretching from Bombay on the west coast to Calcutta on the east. It had a bureaucracy of several thousand European employees and tens of thousands of Indian workers, agents, and soldiers. It had relationships, commercial, diplomatic, and military, with dozens of Indian rulers, some cooperative, some hostile, most somewhere in between. And it had shareholders in London who expected year after year a return on their investment. That last fact is the one that histories of the company most often understate. The pressure of the dividend was constant. The directors who ran the company from their offices on Leadenhall Street received quarterly reports from their governors in India. And those governors knew with absolute clarity that their continued employment depended on the numbers going in the right direction. Revenue up, costs down, threats neutralized, margins protected. This was not a conspiracy. It was a performance management system. And performance management systems, when applied to men with guns in politically unstable territories, produce predictable results. They produce war. Bengal in 1756 was the wealthiest province in India, possibly the wealthiest region on earth. Its textile industry produced cotton and silk that clothed half the known world. Its agriculture was productive beyond the capacity of European soil. Its capital, Murshidabad, was said to contain more wealth than the city of London. Its ruler was Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Bengal. He was 23 years old, recently crowned, and deeply suspicious of the East India Company's growing military presence in his territory. He had watched the company fortify Calcutta. He had watched it expand its garrison. He had received intelligence, accurate intelligence, that the company was preparing its defenses not against the French as they claimed, but against Mughal authority in general, which in Bengal meant against him. In June 1756, Siraj-ud-Dowlah marched on Calcutta with 50,000 soldiers. The company's defenders, outnumbered and poorly led, collapsed within days. The British prisoners taken in the fall of Calcutta, somewhere between 64 and 146 of them, depending on which account you read, were held overnight in a small room that became known, in the telling that reached London, as the Black Hole of Calcutta. Many died. The exact number has been disputed by historians for 2 centuries. What is not disputed is the effect the story had in London. The directors of the East India Company, reading dispatches in their offices on Leadenhall Street, did not see a political confrontation between a sovereign Indian ruler and a foreign trading company operating on his territory. They saw an attack on British property, British subjects, and British commercial interests. They saw a threat to dividends. They sent Clive back to India with orders to recover Calcutta and restore the company's trading position. Clive had broader ideas. June 23rd, 1757. The mango groves at Plassey, on the banks of the Bhagirathi River, about 100 miles north of Calcutta. Clive commanded 3,000 soldiers, around 1,000 Europeans, the rest Indian sepoys in company service. Facing him across the field was the army of Siraj-ud-Dowlah, 50,000 men, 50 cannon, and the legitimate sovereign authority of Bengal. By any rational military calculation, this should have been a massacre. Clive was outnumbered roughly 17 to 1. But Clive had been corresponding for months before the battle with Mir Jafar, Siraj-ud-Dowlah's own commander-in-chief. And those letters contained something more powerful than any military strategy: a promise. When the Nawab fell, Mir Jafar would replace him. The company would recognize his authority. And Mir Jafar, in exchange, would ensure that the decisive moment of battle never actually arrived. It was not in any honest sense a battle. It was a transaction. When the fighting began, Mir Jafar's forces, the largest portion of the Nawab's army, stood still. They watched. They waited. Siraj-ud-Dowlah, seeing his own commanders betray him in real time, fled the field. He was captured within days and killed shortly after, almost certainly on Mir Jafar's orders. Clive entered Murshidabad. He installed Mir Jafar as Nawab. And then, with a thoroughness that revealed precisely how completely he understood what had just happened, he negotiated the terms of the company's reward. The figures require a moment to absorb. The company received £3 million sterling, a sum equivalent to billions in modern currency, as reparation for losses sustained during Siraj-ud-Dowlah's attack on Calcutta. Clive personally received £234,000, plus a land grant generating £27,000 annually. Every senior officer and official who had participated in the conspiracy received proportionate payments. The shareholders in London received word that the company's position in Bengal had been, as the dispatches delicately phrased it, secured. What the dispatches did not fully articulate, what perhaps even Clive himself did not entirely grasp in the aftermath of Plassey, was the nature of what had been secured. It was not a trading advantage. It was not a favorable commercial treaty. What the company had secured in the mango groves at Plassey was the functional sovereignty of Bengal. Mir Jafar was the Nawab in name. He sat in the palace. He wore the robes. He received visitors in the manner of a ruler. But the army behind him was a company army. The treasury he drew from was audited by company accountants. The political decisions he made were made with careful awareness of what the company's governor in Calcutta would or would not permit. He was, to use the language of modern finance, a managed asset, and Bengal, its taxes, its trade, its agricultural output, its textile industry, its extraordinary wealth was the portfolio. What followed Plassey is sometimes described in older histories as the company assuming the burdens of governance. That phrase deserves to be examined with some care. In 1765, the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II granted the company the Diwani, the right to collect revenue from Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This was the legal formalization of what had been practically true since Plassey. The company was now officially the tax authority for a territory of approximately 30 million people. The company's response to this responsibility was systematic and, by any humane standard, catastrophic. The existing systems of revenue collection in Bengal were already demanding. The company made them more so. Local tax officials, the zamindars who had administered collection for generations and who understood the rhythms of agricultural seasons, the fluctuations of local economies, the difference between what could be extracted and what would cause collapse, were replaced or overridden by company systems that operated on a simpler principle. The numbers in the London ledger needed to go up. They went up. For a few years, they went up impressively. The directors congratulated themselves. The shareholders received their dividends. And then, in 1769, the monsoon failed. The Bengal famine of 1770 killed somewhere between 1 and 10 million people. Historians debate the upper bound. Nobody seriously debates that the death toll was catastrophic or that the company's revenue policies made it worse. When crops failed and food became scarce, the company's tax collection did not slow, could not slow. The quarterly numbers in London were not structured to accommodate famine in Bengal. A man who could not pay his land tax had his land seized. A farmer who had sold his seed grain to meet his revenue obligations could not plant the following season. A village that had survived bad harvests for centuries, because the traditional systems of local governance included mechanisms for debt relief and communal survival, found those mechanisms dismantled and replaced with the company's arithmetic. The company's revenue from Bengal declined that year because enough people had died that there were fewer people to tax. The directors noted this in their reports. They described it as a disruption to commercial operations. It is in this period of the company's history that a pattern becomes visible, which will define the decades that follow. The pattern is not cruelty exactly, though cruelty is certainly present. It is something more structural and in some ways more troubling. The complete inability of a profit-seeking organization to process human cost as a meaningful variable. The company's accounting was meticulous. It recorded everything: revenues, expenditures, troop movements, shipments, the salaries of every European employee ranked by grade, the cost of ammunition, the depreciation of naval vessels. What it could not record, because it had no system for doing so, was what it cost the people it governed to generate those revenues. The ledger had no column for famine, no entry for dispossession, no accounting for the destruction of industries that had existed for centuries before the company arrived and would not exist in the same form after it left. This was not hypocrisy. The men who ran the company did not think of themselves as monsters. Many of them were, by the standards of their era and social class, decent enough human beings who attended church and wrote affectionate letters to their wives and felt genuine satisfaction at a well-managed quarter. They simply operated within a system that made certain things visible and certain things invisible. And the things it made invisible were, for the people of Bengal, matters of survival. By the 1770s, the transformation that had begun in a London meeting room in 1599 was complete in all but name. The East India Company employed 260,000 soldiers, more than the standing army of Great Britain itself. It governed territories containing tens of millions of people. It collected taxes, administered justice, made war, negotiated treaties, and in every practical sense performed the functions of a sovereign state. It paid dividends. In London, the directors of this extraordinary enterprise continued to meet to review reports, to set targets, to manage what they understood as a commercial enterprise operating in challenging conditions. In India, the consequences of those meetings spread across a subcontinent in ways that would take centuries to fully account for. The balance sheet was growing. And somewhere in the columns the ledger could not contain, the cost was accumulating too. Part 3. Closing the books. The reckoning, the collapse, and the legacy. We are still living in the spring of 1772. A 33-year-old member of the British Parliament stood up in the House of Commons and delivered a speech that nobody particularly wanted to hear. His name was Edmund Burke. He was Irish-born, intellectually restless, and possessed of a quality rare in political life then as now: the willingness to follow an argument wherever it led, regardless of whether the destination was comfortable. What Burke had been following for months was a set of documents: reports from India, accounts from company servants, testimony from traders and soldiers and administrators who had watched from close range what the East India Company had built in Bengal and what it had done with the building. What Burke told Parliament that spring was not complicated. He said, in essence, a private corporation is governing 30 million people with no accountability to those people, no accountability to Parliament, and no accountability to any law beyond its own interest. He said this was wrong. He said it would end badly. He said Parliament had both the authority and the obligation to intervene. Parliament listened politely. Then it did almost nothing. This would become the defining rhythm of the company's final century. Scandal, outrage, inquiry, minor reform, and then a return to business as usual. The system was too profitable, the company's political connections too deep, and the men who might have acted too invested in the returns to do what Burke was asking them to do. So, the ledger kept running, and the costs kept accumulating. Robert Clive came home to England in 1767, a very rich man and a deeply troubled one. The fortune he had extracted from India was staggering, by some estimates equivalent to 40 million pounds in modern terms, by others considerably more. He had used it to buy country estates, parliamentary seats, and the kind of social respectability that English society of the period sold to anyone with sufficient funds and sufficient willingness to overlook how the funds were acquired. Parliament was less willing to overlook than the social circuit. In 1772, a parliamentary inquiry into the company's conduct in India called Clive to account for the fortune he had made at Plassey. The proceedings were lengthy, uncomfortable, and ultimately inconclusive. Clive defended himself with a line that has outlasted almost everything else he said. He stood astonished at his own moderation. Given what he could have taken, he argued, what he actually took was practically restrained. Parliament voted to censure him, then voted to thank him within the same session. A performance of institutional confusion that perfectly captured the impossibility of holding the company accountable within the political system it had come to partially own. 2 years later, in November 1774, Clive died at his home in London. The cause was recorded as unknown. Most historians believe it was suicide. He was 49 years old. The man who had, more than any other individual, transformed a trading company into a sovereign power, died in a bedroom in Berkeley Square, by his own hand, having never fully reckoned with what he had built. The company, which owed its Indian empire substantially to him, noted his passing in its records and continued operations. The reform that Burke had demanded in 1772 came eventually in diluted form. The India Act of 1784 created a board of control, a government body with nominal oversight of the company's political and military decisions. The company retained its commercial operations, its army, its territories. It simply now had to report to a committee. In practice, this changed less than it appeared to change. The men appointed to the Board of Control tended to be men who shared the company's assumptions about India. The company's directors, experienced in the specific art of managing their relationship with Parliament, learned quickly how to give the board what it needed to feel satisfied without materially altering what the company actually did. What the company actually did in the decades following 1784 was expand. This is the period that older histories sometimes describe as the height of company rule, the era of governors-general like Warren Hastings and Richard Wellesley, men who understood themselves not as corporate managers, but as builders of empire, who prosecuted wars against the Mysore Sultanate, the Maratha Confederacy, and the Sikh Empire with the systematic energy of men who had convinced themselves that conquest was civilization. Wellesley, who served as Governor-General from 1798 to 1805, was particularly explicit about his ambitions. He wrote to London with barely concealed impatience at the Board of Control's occasional hesitations. He did not think of himself as an employee of a trading company. He thought of himself as a Roman consul, extending the reach of a superior civilization into territories that would benefit from the extension. The directors in London were more ambivalent. Wellesley's wars were expensive. The Board of Control worried about overextension. There were genuine recurring debates in London about whether the company should be governing India at all, or whether it should retreat to its original commercial mandate. But each time the debate reached its conclusion, the same logic prevailed. The territories already held could not be safely relinquished. The army already built could not be cheaply disbanded. The revenues already extracted had created dependencies on the British economy, on the Crown's finances, on the personal fortunes of too many people with too many seats in Parliament. That made withdrawal practically impossible. The company had become, in the language of a later era, too big to fail. So it continued to expand, and its army continued to grow, and the ledger continued to run. The sepoys who made up the vast majority of that army were, by the 1850s, among the most experienced soldiers in Asia. They had fought in campaigns from Afghanistan to Burma. They had upheld the company's authority across a subcontinent for a century. They were professional soldiers in every meaningful sense, trained, disciplined, organized into regiments with their own traditions and histories. They were also men, men with religions, with communities, with dignities that could be affronted and humiliations that could accumulate past the point of endurance. The cartridge that set off the rebellion of 1857 was, in retrospect, almost beside the point. The story that new Enfield rifle cartridges were greased with pig and cow fat, requiring soldiers to bite them open in a manner offensive to both Muslim and Hindu, was the spark, not the fire. The fire had been building for decades. It was the fire of 100 small humiliations. Indian officers passed over for promotion in favor of less experienced Europeans. Traditional customs overridden by company administrators convinced of their own cultural superiority. Land tenure systems dismantled in the name of efficiency, destroying the economic foundations of communities that had survived for centuries. Rulers deposed under the doctrine of lapse, a company policy declaring that any Indian kingdom without a male heir would be absorbed into company territory, regardless of whether adopted heirs existed, regardless of treaties, regardless of anything except the company's appetite for revenue. The rebellion, when it came, was not a mutiny in any meaningful sense of the word. It was an uprising that spread from the sepoys of the Bengal army to civilians across northern India, drawing in dispossessed rulers, displaced landlords, farmers who had lost their land, and ordinary people who had spent a decade watching the world they knew be systematically dismantled by an organization that answered to shareholders in London. It took the company, now receiving urgent military assistance from the British Crown, over a year to suppress it. The reprisals were savage. Villages were burned. Prisoners were executed in ways designed for maximum symbolic terror. The violence on both sides reached depths that the company's sanitized quarterly reports had never been designed to record. When the fighting was over, Parliament finally did what Edmund Burke had demanded 85 years earlier. The Government of India Act of 1858 transferred all of the company's governing authority, its territories, its army, its civil administration, to the British Crown. Queen Victoria was proclaimed Sovereign of India. The Governor-General became a viceroy answerable to the Crown rather than to a board of directors. The East India Company as a governing entity ceased to exist. The corporation itself stumbled on for a few more years, stripped of its Indian territories, stripped of its army, stripped of the monopoly rights that had defined it since Elizabeth's charter in 1600. It managed, with diminishing purpose, a tea trade. It administered, with decreasing relevance, a training college for civil servants. In 1874, it was formally dissolved by Act of Parliament. 273 years after its founding, the East India Company was wound up. Its final accounts were settled. Its remaining assets were distributed. Its last employees were pensioned off. And the ledger that had opened on the last day of the year 1600 was, at last, closed. Except that it was not, in any meaningful sense, closed. The consequences of what the company had done in India did not dissolve with the corporation. They were written into the landscape of the subcontinent in ways that the formal transfer of sovereignty could not undo, and that the Victorian administrators who inherited the company's territories did not, for the most part, attempt to undo. The deindustrialization of India, which had begun under company rule and continued under the Crown, left one of the world's historically great manufacturing economies dependent on the export of raw materials and the import of finished goods. A dependency structured entirely around British commercial interests and enforced, when necessary, by British military power. The textile industries of Bengal and Gujarat, which had supplied the world before the company arrived, had been systematically undercut by policies that protected British manufacturers and taxed Indian ones. By the mid-19th century, the economic relationship had been effectively reversed. India, once an exporter of finished cloth, was now an exporter of raw cotton and an importer of British textiles. The revenue systems the company had designed originally to extract maximum short-term return from Bengal, had been extended across the subcontinent and hardened into permanent structures. The zamindari system, which the company had amplified into an instrument of extraction, created landlord classes with legal title to land that traditional systems had never recognized in the same way, and tenant farmers with obligations that traditional systems had never imposed in the same form. And the administrative architecture, the civil service structures, the legal systems, the military organization, the geographic divisions, was inherited largely intact by the Crown and preserved, with modifications, through the entire period of British colonial rule. The India that achieved independence in 1947 was in many of its institutional bones the India that the company had built. The question that Burke was really asking in 1772, the question beneath the question, was not simply whether the company was behaving badly. It was whether any private entity, answerable primarily to its own shareholders, could be trusted with power over human lives. His answer was no, and 2.5 centuries of subsequent history have not seriously challenged that answer. What the East India Company built was not an empire in the traditional sense. Traditional empires are built by states, by rulers who, however brutal, however self-interested, are at least theoretically accountable to something beyond quarterly returns. What the company built was something new, a corporate sovereignty in which the logic of profit was permitted to operate at civilizational scale, with no external check capable of restraining it. The results were, on one side of the ledger, extraordinary. The company generated returns that enriched Britain across several generations. It created trade networks that reshaped global commerce. It built administrative systems of considerable technical sophistication. It produced among its servants individuals of genuine intellectual achievement, scholars, engineers, linguists, natural scientists who made real contributions to human knowledge. On the other side of the ledger, tens of millions dead in preventable famines, economies systematically dismantled, cultures treated as obstacles to efficiency, a subcontinent of hundreds of millions of people governed for a century and a half, without their consent, without their participation, and without any mechanism by which they could hold their governors to account. The company did not consider this a failure. The company's ledger had no entry for it. That is, finally, the thing that stays with you about the East India Company. Not the scale of what it built, not the audacity of what it attempted, not even the specific cruelties it committed. What stays with you is the accounting, the precision of it, the thoroughness of it, the way the company recorded everything it valued and systematically excluded everything it did not. The way a corporation, operating rationally within its own logic, can produce consequences that no rational person, looking at the full picture, would have chosen. The ledger was meticulous. The ledger was complete. The ledger was missing everything that mattered.